Welcome to the Future is Freelance podcast, brought to you by Zolo, the operating system of the solo economy. Every week we'll be serving up an audio cocktail of expert tips, inspired insights, and stories from the frontiers of freelancing to help you grow your borderless business to new heights and live life on your own terms. So kick back, grab a snack, and let's get started. Today, it's just me again, instead of an interview with a guest. Following feedback from the minimum viable freelancing discussion in episode 9, I wanted to follow up with some thoughts about coping with crisis and disaster, or simply the unexpected, while freelancing, whether that's in our individual circumstances or more broadly, globally. Because so many people are struggling with one or the other right now, or some messy middle where global crisis impacts on personal situations. And for those of us in business for ourselves, we often have fewer safety nets in place, emotional, practical, financial, or physical. And those safety nets which do exist are largely those we create for ourselves in the first place. One of my first experiences of freelancing in the face of personal emergency took place more than 4 years ago. And it included the following communications from a shortly-to-be ex-client. Everyone's allowed one screw-up, but I don't really look to freelancers to bring me their personal dramas, so don't let this kind of thing happen again, his email concluded. And I remember I stared at it for a moment, then scrolled back down to check my previous message, the one to which he was replying. Because I knew I'd been sleep-deprived when I contacted him, but had I been in any way unclear about my situation, which had involved my youngest daughter in 8-hour emergency surgery and a life-changing diagnosis? No, I'd spelled things out pretty clearly in the circumstances, a little tersely perhaps, apologising discreetly via my phone from an intensive care ward in advance of a deadline I was definitely going to miss. But the facts I'd shared about my personal drama were in no way ambiguous, nor was I inconveniencing him on some frivolous whim. So I didn't reply to him for a while, as I had other priorities at that time. And when I did respond, I kept it brief and unemotional because there was very little left to say. Unfortunately, I had other clients, people who were genuine human beings, filled with concern and care and support and all the right things, people who completely understood that our lives had been turned upside down for the time being. Others who held up urgent gigs for me and preemptively blew out their own deadlines and offered to help while our family camped out at the hospital 24/7. So one client I didn't even want to speak to, never mind write for again, was no big deal. And as for the rest, I got through it. It certainly wasn't my highest earning month on record as a freelancer, but that's how it goes. And in time, a new normal emerged around a new reality, but at least one that was predictable and manageable. Only working for clients who never questioned that a child's health took priority over just about every other possible thought or deed. That was my first experience of coping in a real personal crisis as a freelancer, without the safety net of a salary or emergency parental leave of any kind to fall back on, only the understanding or otherwise of people who'd hired me on a contract, people who were perhaps quite reasonably less involved with or known to me personally in most cases. One of them, my about-to-be ex-client at that point who sent that email, clearly preferred working with contractors instead of staff, because after all, employees would be fully rounded individuals who might be guilty of bringing their whole messy selves to work, personal dramas and all. So that was one of those moments where you find out what the foundations of your business relationships are really built upon. And like any relationship, you don't really know its limits till you put it to the test. When everything's going swimmingly in freelance land, you're delighting them with your work and anticipating their every need, your work adding value they never dreamed of. It's easy then to perceive a real closeness and alignment of purpose, but that might be based on fairly narrow sets of experiences, especially when, like most of us, you're collaborating online rather than face-to-face. Relationship-wise, you're pretty much still in first date territory when there's been nothing to stress test things in any big way. And don't misunderstand me, online collaboration is amazing and opens up great opportunities for solopreneurs to work with people all over the world. I write about how awesome it is and train people in how to do it. But I'd be the first to point out that it's easy for any relationship developed solely in this way to be deceptively superficial, especially when the depth is being built around a very niche set of overlapping activities and priorities. During this time, you are, of course, accumulating valuable professional and personal credit in the relationship, and that really matters too. But you don't know what people are like until something goes wrong in your life or their life, calling for greater depth of understanding all of a sudden. For example, I learned at that time also that one of my clients, who ran a creative agency, was the kind of friend who said, when I emailed him from the hospital, "Do you need anything handling for any of your other clients? Just give them my number, forward the email. I'll take care of them for you till you're able to pick things back up." What about admin? We have people here who can sort things out for you. Just tell me what you need. And that kind of support was absolutely humbling and amazing, as well as unexpected. I worked for him as a freelancer, mainly by email, and saw myself as his supplier rather than a part of his team because I didn't know anyone else there. But I was so grateful to learn that he considered me part of his team and worthy of supporting professionally as well as personally as a fellow parent and friend. Other times it might be a personal drama on their side, which enables you to be the one to step up and prove your worth in new ways. Especially if, like me, you often end up working with small businesses and startups which have less slack in their system to pick up any strain. Some of them are not unlike fellow freelancers in this regard. And hopefully, like me, you've also developed good personal relationships with these clients for whom you'll gladly go above and beyond when the situation demands it, because you care about stuff for them personally, as well as being so aligned with their business objectives. So they see you as an extension of their team, and someone who has the potential to add value in ways they maybe didn't anticipate, someone who'll treat their most important assets, like their clients, as your own. One example here from my own experience is having to step in and host a content strategy meeting on behalf of a PR client when they had a family emergency, not unlike my own mentioned earlier, one of those moments where you just drop everything and run. Her client was a corporate brand they'd been trying to fix that meeting date with for ages, and I'd been involved in all the prep work for the workshop anyway, as she was intending to outsource the content creation to me. A delay was risky to her whole contract, so instead of cancelling at the last minute, she called me and asked for help. So I put on a smart suit jacket, because it was that kind of corporate client, and chaired the call, working through the strategy development and getting sign-off on each deliverable. And my direct client didn't want to associate her personal situation to that client at the time, so I simply operated on her behalf for the duration, and everything went fine. Arguably, with fewer links in the chain, it was an optimal process, in fact, of me getting briefed on what needed to be done. As human beings with complicated lives and situations, we can do this kind of thing for each other when individual disaster strikes. And I'm really glad that I'm now at a stage in my business where I would gladly step in and do what's needed for any of my regular clients, safe in the knowledge that it works both ways at times of intense personal stress. Those times can arise at any time, but sometimes they're more predictable, at least in some senses. Earlier this year, I had to take more time out from my business for an open-ended hospice vigil. Obviously, that meant saying to clients, "This time is calm and I'm off, and I'm not sure when I'll be back." You can't easily do that with a brand new client, but I was lucky to have built up great relationships with brilliant human beings who were also aware of the developing situation with my mum. And I recall a rare lucid moment in those last days in the hospice when my dear mum suddenly asked me what I was still doing there. "What about your business? What about your clients?" Because she'd been a freelancer for many years when I was growing up and will always be my inspiration. I was able to calm her by reassuring her that everyone I worked with understood and sent nothing but support and love. She smiled and said that was okay then. And while, of course, that period drove a truck through my income and cash flow, I was able to be fully present where I needed to be at a time where I wouldn't have been able to focus on quality work anyway. Safe in the knowledge I had people I could come back to later on and say, "Okay, I'm ready now. Let's talk about what I can do for you." Those business relationships helped me cope with the personal upheavals in ways I never anticipated. Obviously, the last couple of years has brought a new joker into play anyway on the emergency dropout stakes, which may be wielded at any time by any party. I'm talking about people getting COVID and the associated factor of vaccine side effects. And I think In many respects, this has made it easier for a lot of high-achieving professionals to accept that sometimes they have to call a timeout, especially those people who are unused to being incapable and who never before took a day off sick in their working lives. So many people have now had the experience of being really unwell or caring for someone in their family with it. So at least now there's a globally understood reason we can all relate to. And I'm sure it's made it easier to say, I can't do this meeting today. I can't meet that deadline. Or forget recording that webinar or podcast because I can't speak. I can't do anything else which requires breathing or thinking or being awake, and never mind more than one of those things at the same time. Obviously, when you work flexibly from home, it's brilliant for so many circumstances, but you also need to be able to draw a hard boundary and take yourself offline and out of the conversation sometimes, whether you're an employee or a freelancer. So I truly hope that one legacy of this weird time we've all collectively experienced of late might be a greater willingness to talk about our own health needs and limits, both physical and emotional, to call for time out when we have to take it, and understand the difference between professionalism and reliability and hopeless martyrdom. Indeed, it's only by having these conversations and being totally honest with each other about what we can and cannot do that we can support each other effectively when times are hard. And thinking back to that client email I was reflecting on at the start of this episode, we actually owe it to one another to bring our dramas to the work sometimes, especially if that's going to affect the work we're doing and the people we're doing it with. Of course, I had no idea my daughter was going to get sick back then. But when it came to my mother's decline earlier this year, the fact that my regular clients were in the loop regarding the evolving situation meant they were aware of the stress I was living through and also aware there'd come a moment where I had to drop everything and go. We were managing deadlines and deliverables around that preemptively together. And this kind of personal disclosure is not in conflict with being professional, reliable, or productive. In fact, it underpins our ability to be all of those things in changing circumstances, especially when it's just us alone being depended upon. Sometimes, though, the crises are external, and as freelancers, we need to roll with things which affect the bigger picture, things which have an impact on our work at a broader scale. For example, rising costs of living in many parts of the world right now, as a result of geopolitics, war, and inflation. These are strange times we're living in. But I'd argue that operating as a solopreneur is the best possible de-risking strategy you could turn to in the circumstances. In fact, I would hate to have a full-time job right now where my future income was under the control of a single decision maker who might not even know me. Never mind the unimaginable stress of being responsible for the livelihoods of other people. When you freelance over a prolonged period in any industry, you're simply more used to clients coming and going. Sometimes a contract's due to end anyway, a project's reaching a natural conclusion, and you're anticipating an end point. Other times you may have been working together for ages, but stuff slows down. There are fewer needs for your services, or you may sense that your contact is struggling to justify budget for outsourcing. Again, if you have a great relationship established, they may at least discuss this openly with you and give you a heads up or a chance to renegotiate, or at least a decent period of notice. Other times, they may be broadsided by a decision somewhere in the hierarchy of their workplace and have no say in it whatsoever. As a contractor, of course, you're an easy target with none of those messy employment severance issues. But the main thing is, in almost all circumstances, this loss, however sudden, does not represent your whole income base. It might make a big hole in things for sure, for a good anchor client, but compared to a full-time employee facing a layoff, it's never 100%. So it's definitely easier to manage. And furthermore, because you're more used to short-term contracts, to beginning and ending, it's not the same emotional devastation either. Not like some poor soul who has to update a CV for the first time in years and figure out how hiring has changed, remember how to apply for and interview for jobs on which their entire future income depends. Some of them may even turn to freelancing at this point, out of desperation for some short-term income and without even realizing the superpower this choice offers of making sure no one can do that to their income at a stroke ever again. As freelancers, we have intrinsic resilience and strength, and we owe it to ourselves to realize and value that. We are used to change in what we do, who we do it for, and how much of it we have to do at any one time. There's a meme I actually used to have printed out and pinned to the wall in a previous home office, which stated, I have exactly the right amount of work on right now, said no freelancer ever. The feast or famine lifestyle of a typical solopreneur has quite rightly reached the point of cliche, whatever work you do. And the trouble is, when times are good and you're in demand, it's easy to get out of the mindset of prospecting and pitching, to get out of the habit of making this a regular part of your work. When gigs come to you as a result of what you've already done and put out there, it's brilliant. And of course, if it's a choice of taking on that extra piece of work or spending time prospecting for more stuff you haven't got time to do anyway, that's a no-brainer. But to put my consultant hat on for a moment, as it's so much easier to tell other people what they should be doing rather than look too closely to what I'm always doing myself, you cannot afford to let your business development activities slide away completely. And when things are flying along, it's easy to lose sight of strategy and fall into firefighting anyway. At busy times, it's ever more vital to carve out some slice of time for yourself, to focus on whether you're busy with the right things. Is this the sort of work you want to be doing right now? Are you pricing it right? Or maybe selling yourself short? What's the long-term outlook here? Because it's great to make hay while the sun shines and ride a wave of short-term success, provided you can see it for what it is. It's like a seasonal rush. But over the longer term, this approach will kill your business if it doesn't kill you, because you will burn out if you regularly overcommit, and your work will suffer. You'll end up letting someone down. So it's essential to bust the myth that freelancing means never saying no to anything, which might well be a mindset you brought with you from the earliest days. If you resonated with the themes of minimum viable freelancing in episode 9, it's important to be continually aware of shifting balances and the time, money, attention, and productivity trade-offs, and recognize there's only one of you and you need to keep one eye on the bigger picture at all times. Some overview on the work you do, or the work you don't want to be doing next week, but also in the next 12 months and the next 5 years. So even when you're flat out, you shouldn't neglect business development entirely. Just do it really strategically. Think about your minimum viable hustle to keep the pipeline topped up with the work you really want to prioritize. And remember that business development activities take many forms. You don't have to do stuff which feels totally wrong for you. If you're used to work coming into you directly, it can feel really uncomfortable when you have to go back to seeking it out. What, me? Send cold pictures? Maybe if there's work you aren't getting organically that you know you want, some adjacent niche you haven't quite got the depth of track record in but want to get involved in, or you haven't got the contacts, but it's something you know is going to be important for your career longer term. Sometimes you can spot a gap where it's obvious your services are needed, and identifying the value add you can provide via a timely and individualized direct approach might be solving a problem directly for your future best ever client. They just don't know it yet, so you're doing them a service by making contact. But perhaps your own breed of gently putting yourself out there means doing some more social media, or requesting some testimonials, or creating some guest content. It might mean asking clients for referrals, which is also a great way of obliquely letting existing contacts know that you may have some additional capacity at present should they need it, as well as complimenting them on their reputation and connectedness. And remember too that when you onboard a new client, this is a brilliant moment to reconsider your pricing strategy. It's harder to do that with an existing client, though you definitely should do it as your experience and value you bring to them increases over the longer term. Like everybody else, your cost of living has doubtless increased lately. Everybody's has. And if your client were hiring an employee now instead, they'd have to offer a higher salary than they did a year ago. So definitely have a look at your pricing. And because this is a whole other subject, I strongly recommend you check out a recent article on the Zolo blog by Elena Prokopets, which digs into this subject in detail, including some startling news about how some segments of our community are underpricing themselves big time routinely. Remember, this is your business, it's your work, so you need to make these choices proactively, and I'm going to link to Elena's article in the show notes. And whatever you charge, you've still got to find the right number of clients to give you the income you need to support the lifestyle you want, within the time commitments that you're able to apply. And what works for this in your own craft will be specific to you. But for anyone, when times are tight, your balance of work as a freelancer inevitably has to shift a little bit towards the hustle and prospecting side. And if you can't remember how to do that, or you're not comfortable with it, you'll be at a disadvantage. Even if you're competing against other providers who you know are objectively less good at whatever it is than you are, Perhaps their inbound marketing's better because they're consistent about their ongoing visibility, and perhaps they're more on top of industry trends than you are because you've been drowning in deliverables. You can't afford to take this risk. I'll give you an example from my own work. Writing about the future of work and business means working for a lot of collaboration tech brands and publications. This area has been exploding throughout the COVID pandemic, with forced work from home, and so many new ventures got funded, which was brilliant for me because they all needed content, and they were all competing against each other for market share, which had grown hugely. But it still had limits. So yes, I made hay, but at the same time I knew the market was in a bubble, and that not every startup I wrote for or wrote about in this space could possibly have a long-term future. It simply wasn't possible for them all to succeed equally. So I spread my eggs around the different baskets and served each one as best I could, while swerving all retainers, equity deals, or long-term offers, deepening my industry knowledge and experience with each gig and maintaining uncompromising non-disclosure and discretion. And exactly the same thing is going on with decentralized finance and Web3 right now. I can't predict who the winners and losers are going to be. I mean, sometimes a standout loser's obvious even to a content creator, and it's easy to steer well clear. But there are others who deserve to do well but simply have the wrong offer in the wrong place at the wrong time in ways nobody could predict. In fact, tech has been booming for so long that the present talent hemorrhage feels like a bloodbath, especially to developers who just a few months ago were having to write in their LinkedIn headline that they were not looking for work and didn't want to hear from headhunters. I know there are a lot of factors contributing to this, and I don't pretend to be able to understand and predict the complex intersections of global geopolitics, post-pandemic fiscal factors, supply chain crises, and the so-called normal economic cycles. Thank goodness I don't have to. All I know is right now I'm relieved once again to be a freelancer and not to be all in on any single startup or enterprise at the present time. But being a solo agent means you can step back and keep more of an overview of what's happening in your space and immerse yourself in industry trends. It means you can spread your eggs across a range of baskets that won't get smashed all to hell in a single decision made by somebody else. And you can vary your egg recipe book from finding innovative new seasonings for your standard omelette to make it taste different and unique, to researching and perfecting an exotically spicy shakshuka or kedgeree. All right, no more egg analogies. Because the whole idea of freelancing is that you're anti-fragile and resilient, so the metaphor doesn't hold up that well anyway. As a solopreneur, you can pivot faster than any lean startup because you don't have to get consensus from anybody else. You can flex or shift or change direction, do a complete 180 without anybody's permission. This is another great survival tactic. You can shift into adjacent niches, which are a fingertip reach away from where you're at anyway. And freelancers are amazing at this, as Zolo's own data proves. During the pandemic period of 2020 and 21, solopreneurs ended up with year-on-year revenue growth of 30%, while other businesses furloughed into deep freeze and lost income on all fronts. How do you figure out where the puck is headed? You brainstorm, you read, you research, because you know your business best. I'll consult with you and help you if you want, but the knowledge and experience you need is already in your own head. You just need to shift your mindset and perspective to unlock it. Some examples from my own space might be, if you're writing about one specialism, but you keep hearing about something close by where you've got no real experience, but you're curious, then read up. Perhaps the next big thing is just next door to what you're already doing. Then maybe there's a story you could pitch which overlaps both themes. So you can use your experience in niche 1 to get a published clip in niche 1 and 2, and then after that you can pursue gigs with publications and businesses which are solely niche 2 oriented because you've got that published clip. Or if you're an old school journalist, you can open up your mind to the opportunities to be found writing about the same things directly for brands or other forms of content creation. Your skills are already very much on spec. You just need to find out how to pivot them very slightly by reading the right stuff or taking the right course. It's very hard to be purist about things like journalism. So as long as you're careful to declare and avoid conflicts of interests, it's perfectly possible to do both. Same for copywriters. If you're a web copy expert, you should easily be able to switch into direct response or email drip sequences or TikTok scripts or whatever your industry is needing right now. Think about the assets you have too, in terms of equipment, for example. Podcaster, you invested in that lovely mic, but it's probably spending most of its life gathering dust on your desk when you're not using it to sound unexpectedly resonant and awesome on a Zoom call. So how about extending your repertoire of work into something like voiceovers or ebook recording? Do the research, figure out what you need, and get started. Perhaps you'll drop your hourly rate for a bit while you build a new skill, but that's one of the decisions for you and only you to make when it suits. Content is what I know best, but if you brainstorm and mind map it out for your own business, you'll find opportunities hiding there in plain sight, I'm sure. I don't know, for example, architectural contacts drying up? Maybe you should be building in the metaverse. Telephone customer service gig not renewing? Teach yourself omnichannel CX and become more hireable overnight. Coaching clients fizzling out? What needs do they have which you're not presently resourced to meet, but you can research and find out and develop products and content that they're hungry for? Is there a conference or an event or a certification which feels like a stretch financially when income is insecure, but which might make the difference when it comes to new contacts and connections and ideas? All of these near pivots might take investment of time and resources or even actual money. But one thing I've learned is that anything you spend on making yourself more skilled and hireable is never wasted in the long run. In fact, it's often the very best investment you can make when things are uncertain. If you need to cut outgoings in the meanwhile, this is also something you can look at as a freelancer. One of the things you may love about freelancing with Solo in Estonia is how easy and frictionless it is to pay for things. But when payments are automated, this can have a downside too in terms of losing track of what you're paying for. I remember reading something years ago by Richard Branson, who advised every entrepreneur should spend something like 1 month per year in which they personally signed each check for each payment on behalf of their business. This was clearly some time ago, and I'm definitely not advocating a return to posting each other bits of paper to make payments. But downloading your bank statements into a spreadsheet and doing a bit of number crunching and categorizing might be an eye-opener. All those little subscriptions to apps and services add up, even if each one's minimal. And simply because it's so easy to set up, it's easy to forget about too. How much did you spend on news sources in the past, say, 6 months? How much on travel? How much on software as a service, stationery, other office accessories, the latest sexy new tech toys? Of course you need this stuff to operate, and it's surely all legitimate business expenses. But as we talked about before, in minimum viable freelancing, you do have to keep an eye on it. Otherwise, the spending has a real risk of proliferating in uncontrollable ways. And for you to totally not notice this happening when each month's debit is small on its own, or that device isn't really that much of a cost when you think about cost per use, which hasn't even happened yet. And maybe things are fine and you don't need to do this kind of cost cutting right now. Or perhaps the analysis would take you away from paid work you have in your queue. But if the balance shifts and you do have surplus time, investing in the intelligence of your business in this way can pay unexpected dividends. For me, this is one of the real upsides in operating as a limited company via e-residency rather than simply as a freelancer, where all my personal cash flow and business would be blurred and mingled into one pot. Not only for accounting, but for mindset, it works better for me to distinguish the two, work out what's coming in and going out where, and with multiple currencies involved, it's always more complicated anyway. Similar insights can be gained from time tracking for a consistent period and working out what your real hourly rate is, your best and worst paying work on clients. There are apps like Toggle which can help you do this, and I'd suggest looking at least 2 weeks if you want to analyse things fairly. If nothing else, it will help you work out what you should look to do more of and less of. This kind of optimizing and streamlining will stand you in good stead if you need to take more drastic action due to any kind of changed circumstances in your life, now or in the future. I remember when I first read The 4-Hour Workweek years and years ago, one of the thought exercises Tim Ferriss proposed was to ask yourself what you would do work-wise if you had to drastically limit your time. Like if suddenly medically you could only work 1 day per week. What about 1 hour per day? What would you immediately drop from a great height? What could you prioritize above every other activity or outsource to somebody else? No, I've never got anywhere near down to 4 hours, and I'm not sure Ferriss has either. But there's a lot to be learned from this guy about 80-20ing life in general and identifying which of the things you do bring the greatest profit, the greatest personal satisfaction, or other kinds of leverage into your life. And it was that book, I believe, which first opened my mind to another possibility, which I want to touch on as part of your freelancer crisis survival kit. If your income drops for whatever reason and you can't find ways to save money in the business, then most freelancers have another option that a lot of employees don't. Go and live somewhere else where the cost of living is cheaper. Geo-arbitrage is the secret force multiplier that digital nomads have known about for years, and now it's easier than ever. All around the world, hubs of remote workers and entrepreneurs find dedicated communities and facilities for co-working, co-living, world schooling, and endless opportunities to broaden the mind and experience new things. Some of these people are travelling part-time from a home base, and as such, it's not so much of a cost-saving exercise. I'm in that category myself, and what it means for me more is opportunities to travel to events and locations that I can blend with workers' business activities and collaborate in different ways with existing associates. But others are closing out on their leases in high-cost cities or listing that apartment on Airbnb to create a new source of income and simply travelling long-term, exploring parts of the world where it costs a lot less to eat and to stay and to live and to work than the place they grew up in. Some of them even manage to avoid permanent tax residency anywhere because of the amount of moving around they do. Please note this is not personal tax planning or financial advice in any way that I am not qualified to give. Of course, even in a fast-changing world of remote work visas and recognised official pathways to this lifestyle, it can be very complicated not to run afoul of entry permissions and permits. A lot depends on which passport you happen to be carrying and accidents of birth. Speaking as someone who recently had their own freedom of movement abruptly stripped away and is now living by permission rather than right in the country I'll call home, I'm very aware of this. There's also insurance to think about for your minimum viable working kit and all sorts of things to consider before you pack up and head for the nearest airport, not to mention the needs and wishes of others in your household if applicable. But there are global communities online and face-to-face where other digital nomads will guide you on your way. And this road warrior life hack really could be the ultimate in freelancer resilience in a crisis. Operating within the margins of your client's strong currency and how far that goes somewhere where the local means of account is much weaker means you can enjoy a relatively upscale lifestyle and spend liberally within the local economy, flowing that value back to people who need it without taking any local jobs away. And maybe you can even save some income against those inevitable rainy days I reflected on earlier. Remember, if you leave cash in your Estonian e-resident business, you won't even have to pay corporation tax on it while it sits there. So there you have it. Freelancing might appear vulnerable in some respects, and yes, if something goes wrong with your individual ability to work and earn income, it's a big problem. If this happens without warning, all you've got is your savings to fall back on, because insuring against actual loss of income is usually unfeasibly expensive. But you can always be investing in the loyalty and trust of good clients to do your best for them in your circumstances. And when things go wrong more broadly, economically, geopolitically, and so on, freelancing becomes a genuine superpower. You have more flexibility, resilience, agility, and optionality before you than anybody tied to an employment contract, even a remote one. So, while wiser minds than mine predict diverse sources of global turbulence in the months to come, from inflation to climate crises to food shortages to new pandemics, freelancing is freedom, and freelancing is the future, the only future that I would choose to stake my livelihood on. I hope you agree, or if not, that this episode has given you some things to think about, or some new ideas to consider. I'd love to discuss these themes further, and it would be great to connect with anyone working their way through these strategies and ideas. You can email maya.middlemiss@zolo.io, that's Zolo with an X of course, or find me on the socials. Anywhere there's a Maya Middlemiss, that's me, because I'm unique online apparently. And next week we'll be back to your regular listening with insights from a brand new guest, exploring the latest ideas and thinking in freelancing in the future. So please make sure you're subscribed to us in your favourite podcast app so you don't miss any of our future releases, which happen every Freelance Friday. Thank you for listening, and here's to your resilience and continued success. You've been listening to the Future is Freelance podcast, brought to you by Zolo.io, who offer compliance, taxation, invoicing, and admin solutions for fiercely independent solopreneurs across the globe. From simply getting paid to launching a full EU-based limited company, Solar has you covered thanks to Estonian e-residency and a superb suite of streamlined business software. If you enjoyed the show, please like, rate and comment and subscribe to our feed wherever you get your podcasts.